Now I have a couple of concepts that I really want to kind of push, and I will be reinforcing over and over. You're going to hear me repeat it a lot. And it's all about strategy. So we have a beautiful reference, a beautiful image. We have to strategize, and what is going to be the main focus for today is pre-mix our colors. So get a sense of what are the layers and the colors that I'm going to be using so I could pre-mix them, and the concept of painting in reverse, kind of backwards painting, starting at the lightest points. So basically figuring out the light and painting around it, preserving it to create the darker layers. And since we don't have a lot of light and shadow that we could consider here as clear light and shadow, but more opacity or saturation in some of these petals, I want you to sort of think about that. So it's basically painting in reverse while you're pre-mixing in order to strategize with that. A few of those things, like I said, is finding the light. The key is going to be that. So I'm going to start with my drawing first, put these watercolors aside. And as simple as this, making sure we pick our primaries. I have the 3 cool primaries here from Sennelier. And do I really want to explore monochromatically? It almost feels like a monochromatic painting. Obviously the red it's going to be very important, which is why I had all these other here. It's going to be more of a red or pink painting, but I do have the yellow and the blue in order to create those complementary neutrals, grays, for the shadow areas, or for our browns, and maybe push towards the blacks if we need to. So that's going to be my palette here. And all of these are cool colors. In terms of red, the temperature is cool. I will be pushing maybe even a little bit towards the violet, just to play with that. So there we are. Now, how did I come to that conclusion? I remind you, I always keep a sketchbook where, well, got the blossoms with the birds here, but it's knowing your colors. So this is the entirety of my watercolor collection, I guess, my box, where I look at my reds. And from the rose madder, quinacridone rose, alizarin, crimson, pyrum, cadmiums, and then this primary Sennelier red, and that's the cobalt blue here, which I was mentioning, where the reason I like to catalog them like this is so I could go right back to this, and just with a quick glance, sometimes swatches or tests that I've done for other paintings, it could immediately point you to, yep, it's this one right here. That's going to be it. And maybe a touch of here, or maybe pull it, in order to set up your palette. So the first step of strategy would be identifying that color. And this is one way to actually have it cataloged, and very helpful. So the paper I'm going to be using today is a Winsor & Newton, just cold press. It is a larger format. And this is, in terms of size, I believe is a 12 by 16. So it may be a little too large. But today is one of those things. I want maybe a little larger than smaller in order to work, to let the detail develop itself through that wet-on-wet medium, wet-on-wet technique. And finally, the last thing I want to bring up is the most important thing maybe about today's painting is the strategy, and then the end, which is knowing when you're finished. How do we know when it's done before we overcook it? So in that process of strategizing and getting it together, how do I know I'm reaching the end, and how do I manage that final touch where we know it's done? So that process from strategy to anticipating and not going further than we need to. A few other things that we're going to be talking about as I begin my drawing, and I'm going to do very, very light pencil lines here. There's not a lot of detail that I'm going to need to add. Just move this over here. There we are. So I have a full view of my reference, and I'm going to work all the way to the edges, but if this were a portrait of these flowers, I want to make sure I have a nice size composition. So I don't want to draw the actual flowers. What I'm looking more is for sort of those veins and the branches and how I'm going to somewhat connect them to the edges. So you could see here, very loose, no detail, almost blind contour drawing that allows me to just kind of begin to get a sense. Just want to make sure you're seeing my lights. My lines, I really want to keep them ultra light. So you may not be seeing them as I draw them, but trust me, they are there. And I also want to make sure I get a sense of the overall size. So I'm basically looking at this bunch of flowers as one big shape, but not adding any detail, just a couple of edges, just to get a better sense. How big, how high. Maybe you want to identify that this is 1, so a smaller line between it, with the overlap of number 2. And through our drawing, connect to our subject, which is always our most important thing. Now, big tip here. If you want to just copy this reference and make it identical in terms of likeness, you are welcome to do so. But I also want you to take some creative license. Now, how that creative license comes to be, meaning, oops, oh, that looks great, I did plan that. Or do you want to rearrange and play with the size, play with the composition, maybe even play with some of the color intentionally? Or, as always, be ready for a surprise. Now, you may not see this, but I am doing lots and lots of squinting because what I want to identify right now, just a little bit, as well as the shapes, is some of those dark and lights. So mapping out some of that light that is going to be very, very crucial throughout, especially that first stage. And this is something that maybe you want to take some time with. As far as your composition, it's going to be crucial in terms of the overall look and the things you can do. This comes a little bit closer. So some of the first time I'm using a little bit of negative space and a quick correction here to some of this line, which is totally fine. Just adding a little bit extra petals to have these connect right at the edge. Beautiful shaping of petals here. And then the next thing is how we've dealt with contrast. So we have a big effect of contrast through blur and sharpness. So you see how anything that falls to the background is very blurry. We're going to develop a technique, and it's going to be those ultra soft edges of wet on wet washes. And at some point, the idea truly is to really have fun just pouring your paint on this wet surface and managing those values, the shapes, the edges, and some of that contrast. Here we have another one, which is also somewhat of a focal point, part of that sort of portrait of flowers. And I'm not going into the centers. I could sort of, as I squint, I see some darkening, so I could just hint. And again, squinting as your best friend here, really to begin identifying. Hopefully you have some negative shapes, negative space shapes of all of that white, which maybe won't be. Maybe you want to add a little bit of blue to it, a tint of blue that will also enhance that violet feel as it mixes. looseness comes right back to my mind. What is the goal here? In the area of drawing, we want a little bit of that looseness with the line, a little bit of more intuitive reading of the elements. But the goal still predominant in my mind is reading that light dark, creating that sort of a map. And we have another interesting one here that just barely pops up. There we are. So I think I have it. I should emphasize some areas so I can spot that area of light. But there is no wrong, really, once you begin to add your first wash, which will be identifying what those colors are going to be. So I have my palette here, and I mentioned I had some decision making already where I have these primary colors, and I also have this small little porcelain, which is a little easier just to dip in. This is a larger area, so it'll be more convenient. So number one will be my quinacridone rose. I think that's going to be the winner. Obviously, working from a fresh little dab of watercolor paint, it's a plus. If you can do that, I'm going to touch just a bit of rose madder. And they are so close, sometimes you can barely, depending on the lightness. As you look at them, it does look a lot cooler, more violet. But when we begin to wash them and create those light versions, sometimes it's hard to tell the difference. And anticipating some of the more saturated colors, I'm going to touch a little bit of alizarin crimson. So I'm working with these three reds. I added a little bit of that. Well, this is actually always have trouble pronouncing it, dioxytrine purple. But it's there, and I may tap it, I may pull some of it, just to give you a quick glance of what it looks like. That's it right there. So it's very purple, very neutral purple there. And I might do the same here as well. So this is our alizarin crimson. This is our rose madder. And this is my quinacridone rose. So you see what I was talking about. There is that slight shift of temperature. I do have some, and I anticipated this, yellow ochre and sepia. Just a little lighter. For some of those mixes that where we see a little warmer, I will add a little bit of yellow and blue as our primaries to complete this palette, where I need to just pull in a little more orange or go more towards those neutral gray browns. So I'll go ahead and put those right over here. Just a touch of yellow. And that's just a Hansa cobalt yellow. And I'm going to be using phthalo blue for the blue. Let's put it right over here. So this phthalo blue happens to be a red shade, which is very, very convenient. And I'll show you what that looks like right there as well. It reads as a primary, but it is very staining, so I have to be careful with it. And now, I mentioned pre-mixing your colors. Having a sense of, now that I have them ready on the palette, and yeah, they're kind of bunched up, selecting our brush, and I'm going to start with one of my larger brushes, so it's going to be this one here, sort of a mop. And not for mixing, I want to use something a little more sharp for mixing. And I'm going to start with the lightest, coolest red, and I may do a little bit of mix into my rose madder just to have a mixture of color on the palette, and I want to have plenty of it at the lightest value. So here is our lightest value of what I see as those very, very light colors. I already have a little bit of splashing here, so make sure we get rid of that. Also have our paper towels ready. I do have some, just for fun, And because we're dealing with techniques, I brought some salt, maybe drop some of that later on. You have sponges, you have spatter, all the different techniques that we could bring in. I'm going to want to think about it and maybe at some point bring it in, use that. So let's put our palette over here on this side. And since I have somewhat of a feel of a not just an overall pink, what I'm doing is I'm really watering down, really bringing down the value of this phthalo blue. And I'm going to mix just a tiny touch of alizarin crimson in it, so it does have this beautiful, it begins to almost neutralize. It looks grayish, but it's still a blue. It's not deep, deep blue. And what I want to do is I want to make those areas, now you may not see it. It's so low value. I'm going to make my first read of light and bring in just wet on dry, making sure I cover. And it doesn't really matter in terms of preserving the white here, how I cover. Just more, a little more alizarin. And there's this beautiful mixture of slight violet in it that I'm allowed to just do wet on wet. And what I was saying, really keeping that value very, very low, where it will almost, when it dries, it'll be there, but it won't be, it won't overstage these very, very light pinks that I plan to do. So this is one way to deal with just the white of the paper, which could be a little, there's that feel of unfinished or unplanned. I also want to make sure I have a somewhat of a spectrum of that blue or violet or gray sense of the background that I'm trying to create here. And I'm adding more water before I bring in extra pigment. But right here is where I begin to deal with how to approach technique. And it is the next, and I think, mention a couple of things. Strategy, knowing when you're done. Preserving the light, which is what I'm doing now. Pre-mixing your paints so you can kind of manage your technique a little bit better as you set it up, as you visualize. I'm beginning to see some of these blossoming patterns here on this corner that, again, only happen with watercolor this way. You could sort of plan them, but even then you get that beautiful surprise. I know this area I could just go completely over it because I don't want to lose my pencil lines. But I know that it will be nowhere near in terms of lightness or value what I plan to do in terms of layers, as long as I don't lose my pencil lines. So what is the next thing? It's watercolor as a fast medium. You need to work with watercolor. We need to work fast. But what does that mean? So it's not fast in terms of hurry. We got to do a fast painting. And it's all about speed. Yes, you need to time things. And there is such a thing as too fast or too slow in terms of painting. What I want you to do is kind of slow down today. Slow down the mindset somewhat of how you're approaching so you can strategize, bringing some of that color over to this side, strategize and take full advantage of how all of the techniques of wet on dry, wet on wet, to manage edges, to manage sharp edges, soft edges, blurred edges, blending on the paper, blending from the palette is maximized. And that's really what I want for this to be the goal for today's painting. Didn't mix enough, have to mix a little more. As I begin to see some of my edges drying, and that's where, once again, the concept of fast or too slow, there is such a thing. Which one do I need to be? It's beginning to get a little bit into my flowers too much, and I'm going to wonder, okay, is this a mistake? Make sure you have areas where you could just apply a bit of lifting technique if that's happening. So you don't want those sharp edges to just be out of control. You want to control. The reason we're doing this first wash is to be able to set that up. Sort of the distance between background and what will be the sharper. Now with these blurrier areas, I'm going to bring in just a touch of cool red here at the bottom. So I'm going to make this corner down here a little bit cooler than the gray that I've been using by adding a bit of that quinacridone rose to the phthalo blue. And now I'm just waiting to see, did I go too light? I know it's not going to be the white of the paper. That's good. But is it still too light in terms of the contrast that I'm trying to create when I begin to work my flowers? Those very, very light petals. And I just realized something else. With a painting like this, I want to make sure I have clean water. So I may have to go and, as of right now, I have 2 wells. One for cleaning the brush, one for bringing in clean water. But I'll show you. It's starting to look, I don't know if you could see that. One's a little too pink already. One's a little, I begin to see a little blue in it. So, and that comes from just, you can't clean the brush fully. But at some point, I'm going to want that water to be clean if I expect those low clean values of my petals to work the way I want them to. Now, I'm also beginning to think about how contrast is going to work. Some of these very, very light values. Of course, the white of the paper would be best, but also think backwards. What if it was black? As a black background, how everything just theatrically pops out. That's not what I want for this one. I want this lightness to sort of lift and give us this atmosphere of floating to these flowers, the lightness of them, the translucency, the transparency that you see with some of the petals. All of that, we want to make sure we control. And because the formula, we know the formulas, it's through contrast, the contrast of value, the contrast of saturation. I want to make sure I don't get too dark or too saturated in terms of value with my background. Areas like this, I know I can go 2-3 layers. They don't have to be that dark anyways. And the contrast of those two will be, I think, beautiful. Bringing in just a little more. Noticing that some of this blue, excuse me, could really just get into the petals in some of the areas of the petals here. And now, am I getting too impatient? A key word for today is that. When I talk about too fast, too slow, slow down means be patient, but time your technique. So I'm just adding a little extra water to soften up that final bit of edge where I could see, and it's just clean water. Well, I showed you what passes for clean water right now. And just scumbling some of those edges and waiting to see and be surprised at the outcome. Now here we get a little more violet again. So I'm going to go back into that alizarin crimson, some of that phthalo blue, Really, really want this to stay blurry. So your technique of brush application here. And let me bring in another concept. We're not looking at actual flowers here. We're looking at a photo of flowers. You know, that's... what do you mean? They are flowers. Well, technically, in my case, they're pixels on a screen of a certain shape, certain color. They're not flowers that are sitting right there in front of me in my garden or in my studio. You may be looking at a print of what looks like flowers, a photo of flowers. But again, you're looking at ink on paper of a certain color, of a certain shape. So what I want you to realize is you're abstracting. You're abstracting information from that reference you're looking at, even if they were in front of you in life, from life. You are going to abstract information. You're going to synthesize some of that information, interpret some of that information. So basically taking inspiration from that information and doing something creative that only you could do is the key here. I'm beginning to add more and more water because I do love that blossoming effect when you add more water to the pigment that's settled on your paper, and it pushes it, creating a little bit of that format of flower petal that we will be beginning to develop soon after I finish my first wash, which is pretty much coming to a conclusion here. I have one little area here where I'm going to go just a tiny bit more blue. Why? Something intuitively tells me I want this area right here a little more blue. Maybe, I guess as I read it, it's a little more in the shadows. So let's give that a little bit more. And I want to see if I can show you how some of this, there we are. So some of this is just being sort of dabbed on, poured in. You know, the pouring of paint that you see here. And allowing that wet on wet technique to do what it does best. Adding a little more water. And softening some of those edges. And I know you're looking at what looks like just a piece of white paper. But the fact is, it's so light. And with this lighting, it's kind of hard to tell. I don't want to put this vertical. But you do see some shift, a little bit of shift in the temperature of this. Some white paper still here. And there we go. So, we talk about waiting for that right moment. So too fast or too slow. Slow down. What we really want to do here is, overall, the strategy means you need to be understanding what is the goal. What are you trying to accomplish with each of these washes? Every time you bring down a layer or a couple brush strokes, are you understanding, visualizing in your strategy why that is, why it is the way you're doing it? Very, very important not to overthink it, but to maintain sort of a vision, overall vision of why I'm going to let this dry or work it now at that moist stage, because you understand not just how that technique is going to work, but the overall how it's going to, may I say the word, blossom into a beautiful painting. So having my colors pre-mixed right here, I think, just move this a little bit over here. I'm ready to switch, maybe, no, not yet, switch brush. I want to have a paper towel that is clean and ready for lifting if I need to. And going back to that first statement of strategy, painting in reverse. Everything I need to see here is going to be, okay, lightest And from lightest, I want to begin to bring it back out. So I'm going to start somewhere over here at these edges that are super blurry. And I know it's still wet. Some areas may have dried. So using some of this color, and I want to make sure that it is very, very light in value. Still lighter. And just dab. See, that was already too dry. And to the point where I don't want it to just to completely blend out or bleed out with my background. There we are. I need to check. I need to make sure I have the right brush. I need to make sure I have the right value. And I need to understand my technique where I could see, and I do want to show you this a little bit more up close, which will be just like this. The shape of some of these dabs of paint that I'm going to do here are going to be hard to control if it's too wet. But in many ways, that's kind of what I want for some of these. I want them to just kind of fade out, blur out. And the things that I'm trying to manage here are, okay, what about the edges? How far does that edge go? And I also want to think ahead. How is this going to contrast in terms of future flowers that are going to be a little sharper? So do I need it to be lighter is the question. So it doesn't overpower. And again, the key word there is contrast, adding a little more water here. And I love how this background is holding that up just enough where I could do just more of dropping the paint in. This is what we call pouring it in and letting it just granulate a little. What I do want for you to test out is, can I come up with a mix and with a perfect timing of technique where dabbing it down, not brushing it on, but literally just dabbing it, touching it on, can create that flower texture, that flower shape automatically. I am working just a touch of the edges because that is my main concern right now. So I'm dipping my brush just a little bit into my water. Right there. Just a tiny bit. I'm dabbing it onto my paper towel and I'm softening some of this edge. This is the only part where I'm really trying to shape the brush stroke, but you see how some of these petals just remain. And of course, I am going to have new edges where you see some of this color begin to deposit at the edge. It'll be a little sharper, so I'm doing my best to soften them as much as I can. And this should happen a little bit faster as well. But remember, how fast is too fast? Slow down. I'm bringing in almost wet on dry for this one, and then just softly guiding with clean water towards the outer edges, giving it room, and I'm also leaving a few gaps in between. I hope you could see that there, where the shape will be contained, and then some of those sharper edges will completely be blurred out. It's happening here already. I see it over here. So they are definitely out of focus. And we can continue and maybe into some of these. areas where we do have flowers popping up already. Remember, strategy. Pause if you have to. Think. And if you have to re-wet the area, then we do that. Because it really is important how you understand, and I am doing that right now, just adding a little water here. Now I'm shaping this brush stroke because I do have those pencil lines, and I want this area, which is going to be fully wet on wet, and it's only a second layer, actually first layer, because there's still a lot of white of the paper that I preserved. There's already a little tiny bit, so here's a big plus. My water, which is sort of becoming pink, is actually giving me that low value that I was looking for. And we will have to wait just a tiny bit for that perfect moment, that magic moment that we call, where we could just dab it on. And I'm going to start with those two spots right there. Squinting. Bring one more. See, as I move away, I don't want to forget about these areas where I could see a little more. And here, for example. And have that at different stages give me different variations of the brush stroke. Dabbing a little extra water here. Soften up a little bit of the shape. This one completely leave it alone. And this, the longer you leave alone, the more it's going to just expand, soften, and give you texture, really. I need to let this dry just a little bit more. So I bring a little extra water right in here and begin to work almost, well, again, biggest, simplest to smaller, more complex is the formula that we could follow here. Not going into petals yet. I'm going still like flower shapes. And I'm adding a little bit of moisture, clean water. And even more, knowing I'm going to go right into this area. In the background, more blur. While I wait. Another method that you could use would be to use one of these. It's a little less controlled, but if you just give it a quick, you could find actually really nice accidental, depending on where it landed and how it's dispersed in terms of gaps in the water. You could find some really interesting techniques that you could use to your favor, use to your advantage. And now I really have to be patient. So working one area, beginning to see how it's covering the paper, bringing in just a little more mixture. And I'm still at stage one where it's almost one color, my general base local color. But I really am tempted to begin to look at tints and shades of that color. And by tints, obviously, we're not adding white, but the lower value and how I'm going to help it take shape through saturation. Still working the background more than anything. And it is just about patience, really. Letting some of these dabs of color take shape. If you followed, or if you're timing it, watching a little bit of paint dry. Adding a little more water. And I'm beginning to see my first wash, especially here in this area. Now that it's fully dry, it almost disappeared into the white of the paper. Could still rework some of it. Maybe it'll bleed into some of my washes. But that's one thing to consider. Was my first wash way too light in value? And when it dries, you lose it completely. How much is that going to affect the strategy? So knowing your pigments and knowing how they respond to low value, very, very important. I still see some, and it may help some of that contrast where you see a little bit bluer, grayer towards the white. There's a little bit there. And maybe, as I said, I could bring back just a touch of it. Because again, the key here is going to be softness and sharpness of edges and the contrast they create between them and that background we tried to create. And it's coming along. So maybe I should move over to this side, leaving this, because there's going to be more emphasis. We could actually get sort of a first overall wash with that ultralight value. And as part of our strategy, we'll let it dry a little bit while I move over to this side. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. Now the reason I use a brush and not a spray is I want these to contain. Some of these will be sharper edges, the sharpest edges in our painting. And I begin to sort of shape some of those brush strokes. But they'll be so light, and I'll have to come back and rework. That it's important, but it's not final. Although I have those pencil marks, and I'm just guided by them, following the pencil marks just to stay within the lines, I guess. We have some color blending in already. Just a bit of that understanding our drawing. And the next question is also, how much water do I need to add here in order for this to stay moist? Well, the more water we add to our paper, it depends on conditions, but the longer it stays wet. So because of the moisture that was there before, the little bit of water that I add here is going to hold just a little bit longer each time. Now, is that the case always? As I said, not really. Depends on if you have a fan or you're painting outdoors. Also the type of paper. But again, wanting to do this at the right time, you want to work at a speed that may affect your strategy. You want to make sure you stay within those lines. Well, then you take your time and you work in separate segments. And you begin to see how some of this is already, ooh, nice. Just dropping in a little bit of water there. And creating those beautiful effects where it becomes almost, again, it starts becoming a little more intuitive as you begin to see the shifting values, the juxtaposition of values, and obviously those edges, those soft edges. And I don't know if you remember, in the very, very beginning, I set up 3 colors. My quinacridone rose, which would be my coolest. A rose madder, which could compete coolness, but in temperature, just a little bit more transparent. I'm going to switch to that one, Rose Madder. You may see a shift here. And the alizarin crimson I'm saving for for when we need a little more saturation. So shifting over to Rose Madder for this flower here. And I do want the coverage to go all the way to the edge. So how much do I need to drag my brush and dip? This is where you pay attention. Choices in technique. How do you drag? How do you dip? How do you pour your paint? And the results are undeniable. When people ask you, how did you do that? Do you know? Do you know how you did that? And why? Why am I not brushing it? Why am I just kind of dropping it in? I know I had that water all the way to the edge, and I kind of want it to be a little lighter here, so I'll bring in a little extra water the opposite direction. And that may be something that works, from what I know experience-wise, to push the pigment back into the center and create that lightness that I want from the edge towards the center. But it's just one big mass of color right now. Do I need to mix my paint at this point right here? I think the color's working extremely well. Could it be a little lighter? Good question. Let's make it just a little bit lighter, especially this one here. And start at the center, bring it to the edge. And then I do just bring a tiny bit of water to push the pigment again. Now this is risky because when it's wet, it's going to create that pushback, that effect of what's called a cauliflower. You may not want that, but because it's so wet, I could drag it. I could almost see how it's settling. I do have some buckling of paper here. So there's pulling. I don't want, so I'm going to drag it over to this side. And because it's just wet all over, I hope you could see this here. I can get away with it. I can get away with the brushing. But just like overthinking, you don't want to overbrush. The ideal would be to just drop it. Leave it alone. So this one I'm taking a little more time. It is our centerpiece there. I want to make sure some of those edges are working. But you should know, I'm not following the reference to a dot. Some of these shapes, well, this petal looks good. I like this negative space. So I'm making shifts and I'm beginning to see what I'm creating instead of the inspiration for it. I look at some values because I do want information on how to handle light, how to handle those transparencies, and some of those juxtapositions. So you see petals kind of one over the other and creating that extra shape of what looks like shadow. So I want to pay attention to that and take that from my reference, but I'm using it sort of freely. I could do it here, I could do it a couple times here, but most importantly, general reading of just adding a little more value here, a little more saturation is what I meant, and taking advantage of this moisture right in these areas. And maximizing your technique, letting this dry. This is beginning to fully dry, and I could do quick layers that are going to just, as I wanted, be there, give us that soft blur and shape, but not overpower. since we're here, I'm going to go right into this also. Very peculiar shape. I should mention those backgrounds once again. Not competing, which is a good thing. So it was a sort of a safety, kept it really, really light. I would have loved to see a little more blue-gray in it. And it is there. So in the lighter areas of the flower, we're going to see it. Here where it's darker, maybe it'll work as better contrast. So I'm going to do something here where there's a little bit of blur. Ooh, it's still wet. That's great. And soften some of that edge so it doesn't really come in and affect those sharper edges that I will be doing later. And I'm doing that again by bringing in just a little bit of clean water. I could also just lift some of it and shape it. And then bring more. And this one's going to be a beautiful flower here. It has sort of that, I guess it's the position. There's a little bit of that variation of shape, I guess, that is. So it's making it interesting. And also the connection to the stem here, bringing this with a little light. And taking advantage, as always, of those spots where the moisture is perfect. And create more and more abstract shapes. So a closer look never hurts. You want a general look. Oh, I love this here. Some areas where you see it, recognize it. There's this nice drip here over by this edge, and it literally looks like a petal. So I don't want to touch it. And it'll be one of those things that if you have it happen, it's lucky. It was meant to be. And you want to be cautious not to affect or change it and lose it. Which could be very easy to do. And we'll let this dry. I'm getting a sense of, is this color or the value of this color that I'm applying here the right value considering what we did? So we don't want to do too many of these layers. We want to try and get it on the first, not having to go back, as I mentioned, and rework that. So we're going to start this other opposite area here. Make sure I got a good read. Just add moisture. And almost in a blind drawing way, draw with the brush, drop in the paint, and very meticulous in what you're thinking about. In this case, value and edge. How can I get that soft edge and have it not bleed all the way out? Let's go ahead and do this overall shape here. I want to make sure I have it right, which is that final blur of flowers, background flowers here. Adding a little extra water. Don't want these to mix here, so be careful. It'll bleed right into it, or the opposite direction, which is no good. You could lose some of that stuff that's happening. And now that I have background layers, and I have some interesting patterns of colors settling, drying, I want to make sure I don't paint over them. If I lose them, how bad would that be? Can't get them back. And they are working beautifully with the shapes of color that I'm adding with that soft pink. Very interesting how to get yourself to think in an abstract way, to see what you're looking at in a very simplistic. See, I need to take this just a little bit further out. And as I was saying, be comfortable with identifying abstract shapes and trying to come close without having to be absolutely precise. There's areas, places where you want that precision, but in others you want almost random. This would be a great example of that. And we have more coming in here, but once again, I don't want it to be too close. It's still too wet and it may affect. So let's just add a little moisture for later. There we are. And paying attention, remember we had this area here we were looking at closely. Do we need to come back and check that moisture? Take advantage of it while it's still. While it's still wet. Because this is still at that stage, I could revisit. So I'm adding just a touch of saturation to it, same color. Just a little bit variation in the value. Making sure you're not getting ahead of yourself. That key word, slow down. Working fast, but not too fast. But slowing down, making sure the decision making and the understanding of your technique is what matters. So here we are. We're going to begin to drop some dabs of paint here. This one's going to be just a little bit heavier than this one. Reading the dryness of the pigment here, the low value, I get a sense of how far I can go with this one on this side. Notice that I'm just bringing in the pigment, dropping it in, letting it blossom. And I'll come back and gently work back in a few brush strokes, knowing that it's going to create, again, an edge that I somewhat can control, but not fully. And the exercise here of analyzing the type of brush stroke that you're using, how you drop or drag the paint, how you help it or disturb it, because we could do both. Intentionally or unintentionally, it's important to see and understand, why am I dropping or dragging or brushing? Am I trying to create that type of edge that I'm looking for? Time to switch my paper towel. And I mentioned water. This is what it looks like still. I can see the bottom, and it's pink. It's still clean to a point where I could actually use what's going on there because of the level of value that I'm working with right now. One thing I want to do is considering what brush am I supposed to be using at each stage. I've been using this bigger, larger brush still all the way through. Do I want to switch and bring in smaller, sharper brush strokes as I begin to push my saturation? Once again, not forgetting other areas and taking advantage of doing 2-3 layers. Notice how the depth. I'm beginning to use, for the first time, a little bit of alizarin crimson. And it's pure alizarin crimson, not mixing anything into it. I may go towards adding a little bit of blue for some of that violet. And I'm actually making this just a little more saturated. We do have some areas where, how white do you want the edge of those petals to read versus the background? And some of the stems and center of the flowers, in terms of color quality or saturation, part of the planning, I think I'm beginning to consider, well, I don't need too much white in there, but I will need some warm, some orange. And a little more of this wet on wet. Just bringing it along. When we really begin to see this coming together, as of now, you see early stage. I think I need to go back here now. And I'm going to do that once again from the center of these flowers outward to begin to develop the shaping of the petals. And the sharpening of some of those edges. I'm going to add a little more water here. And I'm going to bring that touch of alizarin crimson just right there. Just drag it a little bit. And some may say, well, this looks like an abstract painting so far. And at some point you want to convert that abstract sense into what will become those flowers. But what I was saying, it begins to show shifting values, some of the edges, some of the juxtaposition, without too much form. A little bit, just a very, very tiny difference in our subject and our background. Lowering the value once again, making sure I measure the perfect timing for some of these. Dabs of paint. And making sure they don't jump too far ahead from the next layer. Just a little bit of darkening of this value. I keep seeing it here. And again, I'm squinting at a distance where none of this I want, as of yet, to be wet on dry with the sharp edge. I want it just by adding that extra water. You see flow and shapes and textures that I know I'll be able to work with. So I'll drag that just a little bit further, and you begin to see sort of the space. That's what I wanted to say. So for the first time, I'm going to mix a little bit of yellow. I'm going to try to find, I have a yellow ochre. I also mentioned a raw sienna just to play with it. So I'm going to start with light. I'm going to touch a tiny bit of alizarin crimson into it. And once I bring a touch of blue, we'll begin to have a brown. But I want to keep it, just like I did with all the others, a first layer, very, very light. Now, this is wet on dry. So this is the area of the painting where you'll see, and you have to make sure moisture is working for you. So obviously dry is the key. How dry? Because overall there's moisture everywhere. And if you wanted to wait until it's bone dry, you may lose all the other techniques that you could be doing. So I want just a tiny, oops, see, it went into the petal. So it's timing and it's caution how you get to work this. And I think this is just a stage, maybe jumping ahead just a little bit. But once we develop this part of the painting, you could easily see how, and I could really just play with the color a little bit further, make it a little warmer, a little cooler, a little bluer. And where we begin to see that, we do have lighter areas of yellower. So here I really want to be careful coming to this edge. But it's something I can come back and rework with the smaller, finer brush. Making sure I leave a little bit of a distance so I don't risk testing or the bleeding of that moisture. And guess what? It just happened. So let's go ahead and lift a little bit. And almost magically, we get that sense of space. That is probably going to make it easier to develop all of the other parts. Make this a little bit wetter, a little bit lighter, since I know this was just re-wet. I'm beginning to use some of those brush skills, so you could do a little bit of dry brush, maybe. A little bit of layering, dabbing, dotting, stippling. So shaping some of these brush strokes while using, in this case, a base color that I'll rework again in a second, third layer, just to create a little more sense of volume and light. I see a little bit more yellow and green. And the way you want to do this is, obviously, first one was wet on dry, but while it's still wet, bring in some of that wet on wet. So I'm shifting the value, I'm shifting the temperature, some of it being a little more blue, just literally blue, to give you that shadow, or so you could see it here, how immediately it creates a darker and three-dimensional sense. So as it reaches a little closer to our flower, we have that variation. And you could be very loose with this. I mean, the study of light is not something that's going to make or break here. Some of these, just the sense, the presence of them there, gives you everything you need to break the sense of space, to give us that full sense of space almost. Or begin to do it at least. Now the way I drew this, the pencil lines were very, very loose. I mentioned I was doing blind contour drawing, and I wanted to keep those brush strokes almost the same. Just nice, loose, irregular. And playful. So next would be, and I know this is a tricky one, but we do have some of that blurry. So we're going to do this wet on wet again. Just adding a touch of moisture with just a tint of the color that we just used. Adding a little more moisture all the way down. And you may ask, is this necessary? Does the image really need that? I think just a dab of color variation that hints at, yep, there's that blur and almost or repetition of what's happening here, just a sense of it right over here. So wet on wet, just dabbing some of that color. We get a sense of the vines and the branches, the color of it, not allowing it to become sharp, which is the trick. Which is managing that edge. That does a little bit better. And while we're at it, I'm going to zoom in into my reference, and I'm going to look at these. There's so much variation, so many layers of petals that we're going to have to work for these juxtaposition. You may want to start with some of the, just to experiment. I would say, what if we start, for example, here, and test some of that layering that we want. So I'm going to go ahead and switch my brush. I'm going to go to a number 3 round. And another thing is, you should be testing maybe different brushes. I have natural, round, flat also, but I'm using a round. Number 3, I also have a synthetic brushes, different types that would give you also a different sense, a different load of water, a different drag in terms of moisture. So all these different things you might want to keep in your arsenal to test and experiment with, to maybe discover something new that is unexpected and rich for your painting. So, zooming in, I want to make my reference as abstract as possible, where all I see are, I begin to see edges, so I begin to see these shapes, and I kind of want to zoom in just a second. And I begin to see irregular, but they look like triangles or so many different things you can come up with that make that shape easier to paint. So isolating, abstracting your sense of understanding the shape. We do have also to think about value. There we are. So zooming back in. And I'm going to start with this flower right here, with these petals. So it's an advantage to have a digital, in this case digital. So I'm pointing at this flower here, and that is the one that I'm going to be working on. Let's see if I could better center it. There we are. So you're kind of looking at it upside down, but all I see is variation. I do begin to see some of that violet. So I'm going to play with a tiny bit of mixture with that alizarin crimson, phthalo blue, and trying to match some of these very light value on top of my layer. These are going to be, some of them, actually, I'm sorry, most of them will be wet on dry. And ideally, I just want to do them in one brush stroke. Managing the edge. There it is. Starting with, again, painting backwards, the lightest, and developing towards the darker. So this one here. And leaving a little bit of dry brush right towards the edge where I could see. I'm dipping my brush in between, taking all of the paint out, getting a little bit of water, and then tapping it on my paper towel to soften some of these edges. Maybe even disperse some of this. Give us a little bit more of that petal look. Bring another one. I'm going to shift the value again just a little bit, because you do see that, and make this final petal here. Now here it may blend into the previous stroke that I just did. Ideally, you want these two, when they overlap, to be fully dry. So that's something, and I'm softening this edge here. Bring it all the way down. And some of them, I will have to wait for this one to fully dry in order to create that, call it second, third layer, and final layer. But while we're here, I'm going to switch to even smaller brush, my my 1. And I'm going to mix a little bit of this yellow, just Hansa yellow. Maybe even yellow ochre will work, with a tiny bit of this phthalo blue. And I'm going to touch it with just a tiny bit of, let's go back to the quinacridone rose, cool red, and just sort of mix it up a little, because what I want is just a shade, a tiny bit of green. And I'm going to bring that in here just a little bit. Also wet on dry, beginning to see a little more texture maybe. So I'm going to dab and play with variations of the light, but also that reddish and green kind of hint of color that is there. One thing that you may have not noticed, and this is going way ahead. There is a nice, if you look very close, we actually see a tiny bit of super saturated. So these beautiful little touches in the center of the flower that begin to pop up. I want to make sure I have a little extra saturation that kind of diffuses itself, and you see that I just dropped it in, and it's going to make this petal kind of give me a gradation. And we should do that on this opposite direction as well. There we are. So I'll come back, do that final petal when it's fully dry, and we could literally move to the next one. So step by step, that would be one. Switching brush again, making sure, working backwards. I'm using alizarin crimson with just a touch of that phthalo blue. But I do have a little bit of a spectrum going where I could make it a little more blue or a little more violet. What I do want to manage is the value still as a layer. It could get away from me. So what do we do on this one? We have one big one right here. Just there it is. Using your technique, soften some of the edge at the top. And you could actually begin to work a little more gestural here. But as long as you maintain the pace, slow down. This may have gotten a little too saturated. It's already competing with this previous one. And I have to wait till this dries to put the final one. And some of these earlier ones here are so light. I almost want to go back to wet on wet for some of these lighter petals. So I'm using a little bit of wet on dry and then really adding lots of water, sort of not covering the previous layer, but glazing it over to create that lighter sensation, but overlap. And I begin to see it there. And there's some on the opposite, just a little bit on the opposite side. Just a touch more here. So when we zoom back out, we begin to see them coming together. Now, yes, this is one of those paintings that may take the size that I was working with and waiting for it to dry. It may take a little longer, which is why I suggest we have a good rhythm going. So I think one of the best ways is to do this. Yes, you do the general, biggest, simplest, and to smaller, more complex, following the pattern, following that strategy, beginning to understand technique and getting to that intuitive place where it's all making perfect sense. It has a lot to do with how you're seeing it. And when you begin to see it and you can interpret and play with it, that's exactly what we want. Zooming in helps you, making it abstract helps you, and then making some of those choices from a place where there's almost no way to make a mistake because the information is so simplified. So a little bit of wet on dry and softening some of these edges. So I want some of these edges to be harder like this one, and then on the opposite side, just soft all the way to full blur, which is just carefully bringing some of this water, soft, not letting it pour back into my pigment. And maybe switching brushes in between so you can manage some of these shapes a little bit better. And then I'll just pull some of this pigment and create some of those extra blur shapes that will be hard to read. I mean, with the light layers that I'm creating here, The overlap is going to be so gentle. I think I'm going to love it. I think it's what we were aiming to from the beginning. That seemed, at some point, it seemed like, how is this going to be possible? With such lightness and transparency, you begin to just abstract it. Some of it, you can't forget, has to be through not just shifting value. I'm going to do some of it here. You may see it very, very obvious, which is another reason why, and I'll do it with my smaller brush, just in case. Bringing in a little bit of the phthalo blue, playing with that violet, but pushing it towards a little more gray area. And just bringing it in clean, where you begin to see some of these sort of shades of that color, which is in the background. But it reads as light shadow, and then obviously completing the shape. For this one, I think I need to go back into the yellows and browns and darken some of these shapes here. And I will have to revisit, because the key is when the timing is wrong. This is still wet. You could undo all of that beautiful work. So that's patience, a matter of really knowing how you could hurt your piece by trying to rush. So I'm going to leave that alone for a little bit. Maybe 1-2 more layers coming up. Not much in terms of brush strokes or color variation. Just a little more saturation, 1 or 2 overlaps, and we should be fine. So now I'm going to move to the center, to our, and I'm going to start with this one here at the top. So from lightest to darkest, I'm going to start there. And how do I create some of these overlaps? Using the color that I have here already. I mentioned zoom in. Zoom in, zone out as much as you can, isolating the shapes and the colors. So we do have some beautiful overlapping shapes. They do get more saturated. They do get bluer or grayer. The value is still so. Is it the value, or is it our read of transparency? Squint. You'll find your answer. So here's one, and I'm risking it here. I think I got it. So this shape we could almost leave alone on this side. It is a little sharper. There it is. And using that same pattern with that same color that we have there, I think I made a good read. We're going to shape some of these petals at the tip. And gently create that overlap, which in our case it's just an illusion. Softening and making sure you don't really push the contrast too far in one direction. Kind of losing it there now. And a little more here at the bottom. Also more saturated. In some cases, just a little more linear. So from shapes, we begin dealing with line. That's a good sign. It means we're reaching a stage where we need to be cautious. It's coming to an end, to the end, close to a finish point. And I'm going to stay away from this a little bit because it's our final, the final stage where I'm going to put the details. And then soften that edge. So all of these beautiful colors and sharp shapes that we have here in the center, I'm going to have to really let that dry. There's a little shift in color. So to see it better, keyword, patience. Make sure you blend and mix your colors. Check your value. I'm wondering if I'm using the right brush here. So that's a good question. Am I capturing that brush stroke in the simplest way possible, which is a one and done, the way you would want this? And remember, you're not looking at flowers, you're just looking at shapes of variation in value and a little bit temperature, color, and trying to capture that. Not a lot of linear stuff here. And the more you come to grips with that it is technique, shapes, and color, value that you need to be focused on here, the better you see them. Once you can just break them apart and bring them over to the paper as you see them, the better results you're going to have. Now these, there's a little bit of curve that I notice on these that it was kind of unintentional. It makes my petals look like they're curving. So I did not, in efforts of trying to capture the right value, I probably missed the shape. It happens. Or, once again, do I have the right brush? There's a lot of layering and overlapping that is going to happen here. So you also want to make sure you time it. So I'm looking, still trying to figure out what the next stroke is, what the next layer is. Soften some of these edges. And let the paint settle. So many beautiful shapes here popping up. And you want to maybe, one of the crucial things here is how much blending on the palette, how much blending on the paper are you allowing yourself to play with? So I just started blending just a bit of cooler colors back into the mix on the same layer. And as simply and as beautifully as I could say it, you do become the flower. Connecting with your subject to the point where the lightness, it's almost automatic. You know all the tricks, you know how to bring the technique, but somehow you get to the point where you get lost in the subject. You really feel it. The lightness, the light, the texture. And maintain that patience to develop all those things, to see them clearly. I'm beginning to feel like I want to get a little more abstract here. Like some of these shapes are really pushing me in a direction where it's really interesting. And again, you may see this where the layering is so intricate with the transparency. It may take hours to get through it. And if necessary, are you willing to do that? And that is because you're going to have to work your way around, work and wait in order to really come close to not just the capturing of those shapes, but the layering and the shifting of the value. And now that I'm looking at this area here, I realize how I rushed it here. And sometimes there's no way to make that correction. So you live with it. Learn for next time. Adding a little more water, just coming to these final. And again, it's about edges more than anything here, because we're dealing with some sharper edges and how they just, in many cases, disappear. Almost feel like they disappear from the hard edge into just transparent. And also dealing with the shape of them. Beautiful. There's many, many more. But as I mentioned before, it does come down to layering as you shift the value, and waiting until the time is right. So I want to go ahead and just finish with this one here. So I'm going to go, this is still wet, but I wanted to just, I'm going to go to my smallest brush now. My 0, nope, don't have the 0. Need a 0, 0. Or a 0 at least. So this is my 0, 0. I'm going to mix, here's where you may want a cool red. I'm sorry, a warm red. But I'm going to use the same alizarin crimson, and I'm going to mix it with yellow ochre. Try to see an orange. If that's not working, I'll use it as my sort of brown. And that is sort of more of a brown. So I'm going to use the cool yellow. There we go. With alizarin crimson. And I'm trying to create nice, sort of a nice bright orange. Again, always sort of in a spectrum. I think that's it right there. Yeah, it definitely is the temperature. Now saturation is going to be pretty much my most saturated color in the whole painting. But I don't want to jump too far. I want to keep it also light still. I could test it in a separate area here. Making sure I have the right brush. And the first thing I'm going to do is, because it's just a little brighter, you could do a little greener as well. I'm going to go ahead and do those stems and trying to follow the simple shape, the angle of them. Obviously they're foreshortening, so really pay attention to what the angle is saying. It's a little bit of a curve line. I know it's really, really tiny. I hope you could see it, because it's about to get just a little, in this case, that's my yellow ochre, alizarin crimson. And dabbing it into that nice little circle. Now the proportion, the size of these is crucial. Am I making them too small? You definitely don't want to make them too big. They are delicate. There's a little bit of light. It seems like there may be a little extra shadow that I need to bring in. So before you do this, make sure you have all of your center developed and ready. As your final, I guess it would be the final act, the final stage of your detail development here. And there we have it. So the reason they're small and fine is because there's going to be so many of them. So once we begin to see more and more, and I think there's going to be a need, and I'm going to do that now, just using that same quinacridone rose, but more saturated. I'm going to bring some of that right in there in a few of these. Because it is the same color, it's only at its highest saturation. I think it does something to it, and definitely adds the volume. But once we have these, you can see how that definitely is the finishing touch. So before I do that, you definitely double check. Obviously, I'm still 1 or 2 stages away from second, third, maybe even fourth layer, which would be a little more opaque and a little more, in this case, gray or blue towards the center, creating a sense of that shadow in the middle. As a final layer, playing a little bit also with the edge of it, to then develop that final bit that we just did with the details. So we'll have to do that and develop that a little slowly. So we have a couple more hours to go on this painting, and just keep having fun with it all the way through.